About aerial lift safety and some of the hazards that go along with that. We're going to talk about how people have had injuries with aerial lifts and scissor lifts and the different kind of lifts that are out there. We'll talk about some of the OSHA standards, things that you need to watch for and be aware of, and training requirements, things to protect your workers and avoid accidents. So that's kind of the overview today, and we'll jump right in. There's lots of different types, and you can see in the picture there's many different models, there's different manufacturers. There's different uses of these types of lifts, and so we want to talk about those in general, the different types that are out there. So you might have heard them called aerial lifts, man lifts, there's scissor lifts, there's articulating booms, vehicle-mounted work platforms or bucket trucks. One of the new terms that they're using now is a mobile elevated work platform. That's part of a terminology in an ANSI standard. And so there's lots of different names, but I'll show you some pictures. You might get an idea of what they look like and the types that you work with. So on the left, we have an aerial ladder, similar to, like a bucket truck. There's in the middle an extensible boom where the boom extends out and goes really far outside of the base of the equipment. And on the right, we have a scissor lift that goes up and down. So this gives you kind of an idea there of the different types we're going to talk about. So what is an aerial lift? We're going to talk about how OSHA distinguishes between an aerial lift and a scissor lift and the different type of lifts that are out there. An aerial lift, it has a platform that can be positioned completely beyond the base of the equipment. So it goes horizontally and extends out, and it can be extensible or it can be articulating. Articulating is where it has different jointed parts that bend and can move in different ways as they extend out. So a scissor lift, by OSHA's definition, is a little bit different. This is an elevating work platform as well, but it only goes up and down. You can see that it scissors up and down on that. There is no horizontal extension on a scissor lift, and so it does not go beyond the base of the equipment. And so by definition, OSHA considers a scissor lift to be a scaffold, and therefore it falls under scaffolding regulations, the scaffold standard. So the difference here, you can see on the left, that's an articulating aerial lift. And on the right there is the scissor lift. You can see the difference. So there's two different standards we go by. And the 1910.67, that is the general industry standard for aerial lifts and man lifts. The 1926.453, that is the OSHA standard for construction standard for scaffold. And so that's where the scissor lift would fall into those regulations. There's some very similar requirements between the two, similar things that you want to watch for to prevent accidents and tip overs and things like that. But technically speaking, there are some differences when it comes down to it that we'll talk about. So with these, you'll want to have a personal fall arrest system when you use these. In aerial lifts, it is required. It's an OSHA requirement to have either fall restraint or fall arrest system on. However, in a scissor lift, because it falls under the scaffold standard, it does not require fall protection equipment to be worn. You have the guardrails in place, you have the toe boards, you have the gate, everything to protect you from falling out, but it is not an actual requirement to be tied off directly in a scissor lift. However, I've seen on projects where general contractors or owners of a project will require that you tie off inside of those baskets anyway on a scissor lift. Whether it's required by OSHA or not, that could be a site requirement, and definitely something that we recommend at Trust. You might as well tie off. They have the connections for it in those. And it keeps you from falling out if there's, if you hit a ledge or you get bumped out somehow, it keeps you from falling out over those guardrails. So definitely a recommendation to be tied off in those, even if it's considered a scaffold. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well and the differences there. 4 elements of an aerial lift. There's 4 main components to it. You'll want to know this before you use it. They have a base that supports everything. They have a lifting mechanism. There's a platform or a bucket that the worker stands in. And then there's the controls, and those are the 4 main things you want to know about. But you want to get to know all of your equipment. You want to know what the manufacturer requires. You want to know the specific controls, how it works, and you need to be trained on that so you know exactly what you're doing when you go up in the air. You don't want to take chances on your life, going really high up in the air and not knowing what you're doing when you get up there, not knowing the controls or not being familiar or not doing things in the right way. That can really get you into a bad situation. So part of that is knowing these basic elements of the lifts and how to control that safely. Here's some examples that OSHA had investigated of fatal accidents. This is how people had lost their lives. The top one, we had a scissor lift that overturned. So there was an employee that was raised up to about 20 feet high. He drove a scissor lift over a 4-inch ledge, only 4 inches. But that was enough to cause that scissor lift to get overturned and topple over and kill him. And that can happen. The higher you go up in the air, just a small ledge, like a 4-inch ledge or anything less than a foot, can have a huge impact when you're that high up in the air. It really throws things off of balance and can cause things to shift. A second example, we had an employee that was killed when he was thrown from a lift basket. And in this case, they were using the lift to raise a 336-pound pipe with it. And overloaded that basket. They had it extended out, caused that aerial lift to tip over, throws them out of the basket. The employee was not tied off and threw them approximately 80 feet. You can imagine how far that would throw you out if it were falling. Another case where someone was run over by an aerial lift truck. There was an employee standing behind the truck. As the vehicle started to move, it rolled backwards, and the employee didn't know it was coming backwards, and it caught onto him and drug him about 15 feet and ran over him. So those are things we need to watch for. Tip overs, being hit by the lift, those are some of the main things that cause real accidents with aerial lifts. And as I was preparing this presentation back in 2016, a few years ago, I was watching the news, and sure enough, here comes an accident here in the Salt Lake City area that came up on KSL News. There was a scissor lift that was extended up really high, and 2 workers working inside of that, it happened to topple over and critically injuring 2 workers. So it can happen. These types of things happen, and we need to watch for doing the right thing so that we don't put ourselves in a bad situation like that. Here's an example of what can happen. We had here's an example of people that fell out. There was a equipment failure on this articulating lift. They were inspecting the underside of a bridge, and parts broke, and mechanical things failed, and you can see it left them hanging there. Fortunately, they did have their fall protection equipment on, saved their life, but you can see they're left there hanging until they can get rescued. So it's important that we do good inspections, that we maintain our equipment and do the right things, wear the right protective equipment, because it can save your life. OSHA investigates all these kind of things. They try to find out, why are accidents happening and what are the trends. Here's some interesting things that I found when looking through some of their statistics on this. These green bars show percentages of fatalities with aerial lifts, and the blue ones are with scissor lifts. So there's a little bit of a difference between the two. The top reason for aerial lifts for fatalities was electrocutions, and that makes sense because aerial lifts can go up, they go out around the sides of their base, they go horizontally, and they could go up into some overhead power lines and possibly get in contact with that. Whereas scissor lifts, the top reason was falls. The employee falling out of the scissor lift. Now, surprisingly, fall protection equipment is not required in a scissor lift because it falls under the scaffold standard, but still, you see that's the top reason why people are dying in a scissor lift is falls. That's why we definitely recommend wearing that fall protection equipment inside the scissor lift. Another surprising statistic was collapses and tip overs. Scissor lifts had more fatalities of tipping over than an aerial lift did. So those are things that we can learn from and learn to avoid. The main hazards with aerial lifts, man lifts, and all these different types of lifts we're talking about. Electrocution, you want to watch for that. You want to watch for falls, falling out of the equipment or having it tip over, knocking the employee out when you hit a bump or a hole or a ledge of some kind, possibly tipping things over. Being struck by falling objects that can fall out of the lift down and hitting somebody below, or being caught between the moving equipment that can move around. So when it comes to power lines, there's some requirements for that you want to stay away from. Stay at least 10 feet away. It depends on the voltage. There's a graph that shows, a little chart here that shows, based on the voltage, how far away you would need to be from a man lift. You think about that, it's a metal object that you're going to be standing in, and you don't want to have something arc and have an issue with voltages there between you and the man lift. If you can de-energize if possible, that's the best way to eliminate the hazard that you're working around. May not always be possible, but turning off the power to those lines really eliminates that so that you can get up and work in those areas. But know your distances, stay at least 10 feet away, and depending on that voltage, is the certain distance you need to stay away from that there. Falls, like we said, is another huge reason why people die involving aerial lifts. 50% of fatal falls involved ejection from the bucket after the worker or the lift was struck by vehicles, cranes, or other objects. You can imagine being really high up in the air, getting hit by some other vehicle, how that would jar that equipment and possibly cause it to knock you out of there to fall. 16% of the falls that OSHA investigated occurred while transferring to or from the bucket at height, and that's something that you don't want to do. This is a picture of that here. Somebody climbing out over the guardrails of the basket, getting onto a roof or some other structure. You're not supposed to do that. You're really supposed to stay in that basket, keep your 2 feet on the floor, and not climb up or over and out. It just exposes you to a really unsafe situation there. With collapses and tip overs, 20% of this involves collapse of the boom, where the boom failed and it came down. That could be to improper maintenance or worn parts on the equipment. 1/3 of the fatalities are due to tip over. 1/4 of those involve collapse of the bucket. The bucket itself fails and comes down, and 1/4 of tip overs occurred where the lift hit a hole or a curb while they were moving the equipment. So that can happen. Just hitting a small ledge, a small bump, something like that can really throw things off when you're high up in the air. So you don't want to find yourself in a bad situation like these guys, hanging on to dear life, high up in the air, and so we want to learn to prevent these tip overs. One of the key things is you want to make sure that you don't exceed that load limit. You want to make sure you know your equipment, know what the load maximum is, and don't exceed it. Don't carry heavy materials or put too many people in there. Make sure you know the limits on those and don't exceed that. You have to take into account your weight, the weight of all the people in there, plus all the tools and equipment and everything you might be having in there that might possibly overload that. Another way to prevent a tip over is proper placement of the lift. So this picture here, you can see the wheel is coming up off the ground, and they've got that boom extended way out to the side, which is causing them to tip. Again, the farther out you extend, the more leverage there is, the more likely it is to tip over. In this case, it takes a little bit of time, but move the truck. The truck could be in the way. They could back that truck out of the way, get that lift underneath the area that they need to work in, get it in the right position, and not put themselves at risk for that way. So that's one thing you can do. If your equipment comes with outriggers, you're supposed to use those. Make sure you put the outriggers down, wheel chocks, or anything that you're supposed to do per the manufacturer to make sure that thing is stable. Also check the ground that you're setting up on. Make sure that it's level. Make sure that it can support the lift, that it's in good condition, and it's good and safe to go up vertically before you put yourself at risk there. So put the lift where you want it. Make it easy on yourself, even if it takes a little bit of time. Get it in a good spot before you go up in the air. There is a little difference between working with lifts indoors versus outdoors. One of the things you might encounter is overhead objects. I was working on a project one time. We had a guy, they were framing and building a building, and they had a couple of scissor lifts going inside of this building. And as they were going up, there were 2 guys in the scissor lift, and the one guy was operating it, going up, and the other guy was just standing in there waiting to go up to do the work. And so he put his hand on top of that railing on the side there, the guardrail. And as it was going up, his hand got pinched between the top of that guardrail and the bottom of the truss that they went up into. And so that just teaches us that we need to pay attention, whether you're the one operating or the bystander that's in there ready to go do the work. You got to make sure that your hands and your arms and things are not in the way of hitting things that are above you. So always look up. Before you go vertical, look around at a job site, see if there's any overhead power lines, see if there's any overhead structures. Sometimes parts of buildings will extend out that you might have overhead as well. Could be beams or piping or anything like that you might have up over your head. So watch for those things. Outdoor, the biggest risk, overhead is usually power lines. Indoor, the biggest risk is just basically structures, things that you might go up and hit into. One of the main requirements of aerial lifts, and really with any type of equipment you work with, is having proper training. And all operators must be trained. That's a requirement. They have to have specific to the equipment. The training should be specific for that model and that type. That they know the manufacturer's requirements, they know the controls, they know the limits, and they should be trained by a qualified person, somebody that knows and has experience and can adequately train these people on how to use that safely. But only trained and authorized employees should be operating aerial lifts. So there's a few types of training that goes on. One is a classroom training, and this is the type of training we're doing today. You can use this training. You can also do it in classroom. Do a live training with employees to teach them about the basics of aerial lift safety, OSHA requirements, and things like that we're talking about today. But they also need to have a hands-on equipment-specific training where they actually get time in the equipment, using it with a supervisor or a trainer there that's qualified to teach them how to do it. And then some type of evaluation to make sure that they're evaluated to know that they can run that equipment safely. So there's a few parts to that training that you want to make sure employees have before they use those aerial lifts. So the general training should include nature of hazards, precautions, understanding the rated load capacity on the equipment, manufacturer's requirements in the operator manual, and they need to be able to demonstrate their skills and knowledge to actually operate that lift safely. You don't just want to put an aerial lift out there or a scissor lift and tell the guy, okay, go do it, go ahead and do your work, without giving them the training and experience and things that they need to do it safely. So part of training, they need to be familiar with that operation and maintenance manuals. It's important to have those on board on the equipment. There's usually a little black compartment box on the lifts that they can find that in. And that's one thing you want to check out before you go to use a lift. Make sure that the manuals are there. Make sure that there's clear instructions and everything that's needed for that. If you happen to be renting a lift, that's one thing to check for. If the vendor brings you out a lift, ask them. Ask them for the manual. Ask them where the instructions are. Have them show you and teach you what you need to know about those manufacturer requirements before you use that lift that you rent. So as far as training goes, you also want to be trained on how to do a pre-trip or a pre-shift inspection of the equipment. That should be done each time. Before that equipment's used, you want to have a good inspection on it and check it out, because you don't want to risk going up in the air and putting your life and your body and your health at risk up there if something's going to go wrong and fail on the equipment. So that pre-trip inspection is very important. Also do an inspection on the work area. Look around, see what kind of hazards are there, things that you're going to be working around, and things you want to check for before using that lift. So as far as training requirements, the supervisor or the trainer must test the operator's skills. That's part of that hands-on evaluation. And ANSI has a new standard that I'll be talking about as well today regarding aerial lifts, and they now require that the supervisor of the operator also be trained to verify that they know what to look for, they know what to verify in their employee, so they can work safely. So definitely need some good training. You want to know those things before you go using that equipment. When it comes to stability, some equipment comes with outriggers. If they have those, you want to make sure you use those properly. If you need pads or you need to be on a level surface, make sure that you're doing that, because you don't want to compromise that stability and have a tip over in a real accident where somebody gets hurt or equipment damaged or a bad situation like that. Some come with brakes. Make sure you set the brakes. When wheel chocks are necessary on slope surfaces, make sure that you're using those when you need to do so. Those can help to prevent it from rolling away or tipping or sliding out of the way. Again, the higher the lift and the longer the lever is, the longer, more likely it is to tip over. And just a slight movement at the base when it's extended really high is a huge movement up at the top because of the difference of the length there. So the more you increase the height, the more you go out horizontally, the more likely it could be to tip over. So you want to watch that. You want to make sure that you're following the right loads, that you're not overloading things, and that you're not taking it out of range to cause that thing to tip over. Never push or pull external objects from inside the elevated lift. So it's not a forklift. It's not used to move materials around a job site. It's not used to push or pull things. It's not really a tractor. It's basically a man lift where it's used to lift personnel to go up and do work in the air. So watch your slopes. That can decrease your stability. Just a slight slope when you go up vertically becomes a lot more off the center of gravity, higher in the air. So watch for that. Only raise your platform on a level surface. You want that to be as level as you can so it goes straight up and down, and you're not exceeding that limit that could cause it to tip over. So watch for your loads, watch for your heights on that to maintain stability. When it comes to inspections, there's a few types that need to happen. Equipment that's used regularly needs to have an annual inspection. So at least every year, a good inspection done, checking all the mechanics of it, all the functionality of it, and it should be done by a qualified maintenance person that can check those on the equipment. If you're using it regularly, at least every 3 months or every 150 hours or prior to putting it back into service, there should be an inspection done on that to check and make sure everything's working. But it's also critical that you do that daily pre-shift inspection. Again, you don't want to take a chance. You don't want to put your guys in there or yourself in there to go up in the air and have hydraulics fail or something break and have something come down. And that's why it's really important to do those inspections. So when it comes to pre-shift inspections, what kind of things do you want to look for? What would you check out on the equipment? It's really helpful to have a checklist, and this is one that we have that we can share with you. Just a simple checklist to run down, check, make sure everything's good to go before you go up in the air. You'll want to check for manuals, make sure that the manual's on board, that it's accessible. Take a look at the tires, see if there's any cuts in it or bulges or chunks or air pressure coming down. You want to make sure that those tires are in really good shape before you go vertical. Check your hoses, look for leaks, look for any damage, look for any leaking fluids. Check your fluid levels. Look at the guardrails, make sure they're all in good shape, that there's nothing loose or missing, that welds aren't cracked, that gates are working properly and closing properly. Check all those things out. Look at your safety and warning labels. They should be in place. I've heard of OSHA inspectors at times giving a citation because the labels had been worn off of the side of an aerial lift and they were not legible anymore. So if you get a lift, you go to rent one, you want to make sure those are all in good shape and that you can read the instructions and warning labels as well. So that's part of your pre-shift inspection, checking all those things out. You'll want to test the controls. Make sure you understand what they do, all the buttons, all the toggle switches, make sure that you know how they work. Some equipment has controls inside the lift and also down at the bottom of the base of the lift, so that if there's an emergency, it can bring you down. You'll also want to test those emergency controls at the bottom as well. On the toggles, the way those work is when you move them, they should return right back to the normal neutral position. And so you want to test those out, make sure that they release right back into where they should, make sure that everything is working right as far as switches and buttons, and test everything out. If there's any type of damaged equipment, whether that's guardrails or controls or maintenance issues with the equipment, you want to check those things out and look for that. If it's really bad and it's unusable, it's in a bad condition that might put you at risk, you want to lock out and tag out that equipment, make sure that nobody can use it. Get it serviced, get the maintenance technician on it. Make sure you correct those things. You don't want to take a chance and go up there and look over something and look past something that could really lead to an accident later. So lock it out, get the right service done on it to maintain that equipment there. Another critical thing you need to do is a work site inspection. Looking around before you go to use that lift, before you mobilize it around a project or on a job site, check it out, see if there's any drop-offs, see if there's any holes that you might hit, anything that might cause it to drop down, or any bumps or curbs, anything like that. You want to be aware of that around your work area. Look for any obstacles, overhead obstructions like overhead parts of buildings, structures, power lines, other moving equipment in the area. If there's vehicle or traffic nearby or any people that might be walking by, get to know that work site and that work area before you use that lift, to be aware of what's around you. One of the things you can use is another checklist as well, things that you might check for that we just talked about. The wind, the weather, other possible unsafe conditions, things that you want to see and check off before you use that lift. So we can share these with you as well, these inspection forms. So one question you might ask yourself is, can the work surface support the vehicle? Is it adequate? So here we have an example of a trench that a lift came across and they fell right in. So there could be some soft soil, there could be holes, there could be things that are unlevel, there could be plates or covers on a job site that could possibly give way. You don't want to go driving that equipment and find out later that there's a problem with the working surface. So check those things out, do your inspection before, and make sure it's safe. What about weather? So weather's a real concern. You think about going high up in the air in an aerial lift. How would it be if it's really windy? On a really windy day, well, that lift is going to be rocking around. You're going to be in that basket up there and possibly get knocked around with wind and have a possible tip over. So on a really windy day, not recommended to use those. You also want to watch for bad weather as far as lightning and thunder. If you hear thunder off in the distance that could be rolling in soon, maybe a buildup of clouds you see coming off in the distance, probably not a good idea to go up in a metal lift when you're really high in the air with possible lightning in the area. So be aware of weather and the different conditions around you. That's part of your work site inspection. Look around the work zone. See how you can set it up to make it better for not only yourself, the equipment, but also the people around you and the vehicles and people that might be walking by. One of the best things you can do is just set up some barricades, have some caution tape or some cones or some type of barriers out there to keep people from walking underneath that equipment. You don't want to be working up there and have materials fall down or tools get knocked off the top there and fall down and possibly hit somebody. That's one of the ways there's been some real accidents involving aerial lifts, is simply falling objects. So block those things off, control that work zone, make sure that people aren't coming into that area that shouldn't be in there. As far as operating instructions, here's an example of those labels and warnings, the little instructions that will be on the side of the aerial lifts. Make sure those are all in good shape and legible. And you want to make sure you follow those. If they give certain guidance of danger or caution, make sure you understand what they say. Make sure you're not exceeding things and using that equipment in a way that it should be. You want to use it as intended. There shouldn't be any modifications made to the equipment. Again, it's not used it's not a crane, it's not a forklift, it's not used to really move things around a site. It's really used for personnel to work in on a platform. So use as intended, and following the operator instructions is probably one of the most important things that you can do with an aerial lift or scissor lift or any of the types of lifts we're talking about. So as far as getting in and out of the equipment, the best way to do that is bring it all the way down to the ground. Access it safely. You want to use 3 points of contact to get in and out safely. Make sure you put your harness and fall protection on where it's required, and keep yourself with your access safe going in and out of there. You don't want to be like this guy and basically walking the plank, going up to the top of that. That is not the right way to access the equipment. So bring it down to the ground, make it easier on yourself to get in and out of that equipment. Always lower your platform while you're traveling. Now, some equipment does get moved while you're in the basket, and some, like a bucket truck, you can drive the truck into position and then park the truck, go outside and go vertical. But some of them, you're actually standing inside of that basket and mobilizing that equipment from inside the basket. So when you do that, you don't want to be really high up in the air. You want to keep that lower to the ground. You want to be in a position where you can see ahead of you and behind you if needed, so you can see around where you're driving and see what obstacles you might have to watch for. You might raise it up just a little bit if you need to see, or you could even use a spotter to guide you into place. But you don't want to have that up too high in the air where you hit a little bump and can toss you out of that basket. So keep it low to the ground, travel slowly and cautiously. Make sure you have a good view of the directions you're traveling as you're moving those things around. So safe speed is critical. Stay clear of holes, drop-offs, ramps, slopes, or even obstacles. We've had little videos that we've shared in other trainings we've had that show just a simple ledge, and it doesn't look like much, but as you're maybe even 8 to 10 feet off the ground, hitting a 4 to 8 inch ledge can really launch you out of that basket. And so it's really important to be on the surface and take it slow and drive slowly around there. Here's an example of what not to do as well. Look at these guys. They've climbed up out of the basket. Their lift obviously wasn't the right kind because it didn't get them high enough to do the type of job that they had. And so here they are, no fall protection equipment, climbing up on the guardrails and standing out, I would say probably 20, 30 feet up off the ground, which is a real hazard. You can imagine what would happen if they fell off of there. So get the right type of equipment and make sure that you're staying inside the basket. It's not intended to climb out. It's not an elevator. It's not used to hoist up materials or anything. It's just for you to stand in and work in. And so the requirement is that both feet are inside that basket on the ground. Even as much as standing up on the side guardrail or even the toe board is something that can get you in trouble. So stay in there, keep your feet on the ground, and use your fall protection equipment. Here's another example, using the wrong equipment. They use this as a hoist, a crane to push those up and hold those up into place. Again, it's not designed for that. It's not designed to hold that weight. It's really only designed for people to be used in, not to hoist up materials. So use them as intended. Watch for things around you. Nobody should be working below you, standing below you there. Again, power lines and things you want to watch for. Make sure you keep things clear and out of the way there. There's been times where people will use a ladder or a bucket or some other object inside of the lift to stand on to get them up just a little bit higher. And again, that's a violation. OSHA will give a citation for that. Because it's made for your feet to stand on. It's a platform where you're supposed to stand in and keep your feet on, not extending out or standing on top of anything else. When it comes to platform, you want to keep it clean. You don't want to have things in there that you're going to trip on or fall and knock over so that they may fall down onto somebody else below. Part of that is just good housekeeping, taking care of the equipment and keeping that work platform clean as well. So watch for that. They do have toe boards, and the toe boards around those are to keep those objects from falling out. But things can roll over the top of those. Things can even get knocked out over the top of the toe boards and fall down. So part of that is just maintaining it and keeping it clear. Again, some equipment has Some equipment has lower level controls, and these are only to be used with permission of the operator. So if you have somebody that's in an aerial lift and they're up high in the air and their controls stop working, they have these controls down at the base of the equipment that you can use to get them back down to the bottom. But the key is that they can only be used in emergency situations and only with permission of the operator. You can't come over and move your buddy around because he's up in the air and you can use the controls down low. That's not the intent. The intent is only when they give you permission and say, hey, I'm not working up here. It's not, controls aren't working. I need you to get me back down. And then you can go ahead and use those controls. Or if somebody were to have a medical condition or something up top, they couldn't physically operate the controls, then you could obviously do what you need to get them back down. But that's what those lower controls are really only for, is to test out and make sure they're used for rescue or emergency type situations. So look at this guy. He's really high up in the air. And some of these lifts, they go really high. They can be upwards of 70 feet up in the air sometimes, maybe even higher. But that's why you got to have your fall protection. You don't want to take that risk. You don't want to get out overextended and hit something that's going to cause you to tip over. And so it's really important that you wear your personal protective equipment and the right gear, the harness and lanyard. There's a couple different types, and there's other trainings on this as well too. But the basic types are a personal fall arrest system, which if you fall out of the basket, it's going to catch you. It has a shock absorber on it that will reduce that impact on your body, and it will keep you from having further trauma on your body from the fall, and it will catch you. The other type is a restraint system that has a lanyard that you hook onto and attach to. That is only the right distance that keeps you from getting out over the guardrail. It's at a length where you cannot physically get out over that guardrail there. So there's two different types, and they're used in different areas. In a scissor lift, you're going to want a restraint type system because there's no need to get out over the rails. In an aerial lift, especially the articulating type, they do require the personal fall arrest system because there's more potential to get bumped out of the man basket on an aerial lift. And so make sure you have the right type, use the right type there. You never want to tie off to something outside of the basket. The hooks are welded in there. They're designated for a hook off point inside those baskets, and you want to find that right area and hook up inside the basket there. Always inspect your PPE before use. Check the harness, make sure it's in good shape. Check everything out before you go vertical. Make sure everything's connected properly, that you have the right equipment, and that you're using it safely. That's the critical thing there. A lot of people will rent a lift from a vendor. Some people don't have their own lifts, or they borrow one, or they get one for just a few days to do a certain project. And so with that, there's a couple things you want to look for when you rent a lift. One is ask your vendor for the maintenance history of the lift. Ask them when the last time it was serviced. Ask them for the operator's manuals. Have them show you the equipment specific things that you want to check for. They should be able to show you all those kind of things. And the equipment should be in really good shape. It should have all the labels on it, all the details from the manufacturer that need to be there, the controls, everything should be in good working order. And that's something you want to check out and go over with them before you take control of that lift and rent that from them. And if you get one that they bring out and it's all in bad shape, or they can't tell you when the last time it was serviced, or if it's missing operator's manuals, tell them to take it back. Tell them to get us one that's in good shape and ready to use. Don't take the risk on yourself and put your guys in something that's going to possibly have an accident. So coordinate with your vendors, make sure that they can get you that right thing to check those out and use them safely. I mentioned earlier about an ANSI standard that's come out. This is the ANSI A92 standard. It's a brand standard, just came out last year, and it's now been put into place this year. One note on this is that OSHA has not yet adopted this standard. Often OSHA will look at these things when they do their standard updates or their standard revisions, and they will incorporate some of the ANSI standards into the OSHA standards. Well, that hasn't quite happened yet. So it might in the future. OSHA could likely take on some of these new requirements in the ANSI standard. But just so you're aware, there are things you want to be aware of that might be coming down eventually in the future with OSHA. And so one of this is they call it a mobile elevating work platform. That's the terminology that they're using now for ANSI. And that applies to any type of aerial lift, scissor lift, those different types of lifts that we've talked about, buckets, man lifts, all types. But they classify them into different types. There's 3 different types where they classify them, and they have different requirements for it. One of the things that the ANSI standard calls out is the need to do a risk assessment and a site safety plan before you go and use your aerial lift equipment. So you're looking for those work site conditions that we talked about, and you're looking at something specific to the project and the site that you're going to use it on. That could be just a simple written plan of what's out there, how do we keep ourselves safe, what do we need to look for and be aware of before we use the lift in the area. Another thing in the ANSI standard is they call for the need for rescue planning. So if the lift were to fail, or if you have people hanging, they fall out and they're hanging there from their fall protection equipment, how do you get them down? What is your plan to rescue them? What equipment would you use? What is your process in place to make sure that you do rescue them if something goes wrong? And that's a really good thing to do. That's something you'd want to have anyway. But that might be coming down to the OSHA standard eventually as well. And some other training standards that are very specific as well. Like I mentioned, the supervisor of the operator now also needs to be trained on the aerial lift use and the basics of that, so they can know to evaluate and make sure that their workers are working safely. Also talks about training requirements for the operators themselves and also the maintenance personnel working on the equipment. So there's some new things coming out, and again, OSHA has not yet adopted this, but it's likely that they could in the future. So things that you want to know about to keep you and your workers safe on these aerial lifts. So there's a lot of information I've shared with you today. A lot of the OSHA requirements, a lot of the basic things on aerial lifts. To summarize, you want to make sure you're trained. Training is critical. There's a lot of times accidents happen because guys are put into equipment and they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the experience and they get themselves into a bad situation. So make sure that you and your employees are trained, that all operators are trained and authorized to use that. There's many types of lifts. There's different models, there's different manufacturers. They're all different and they have different controls. Make sure you're familiar with the type you use specific to that equipment and get trained on it. Always do your inspections on the lift. Don't take chances. Document that on forms and keep that. If something's wrong, take it out of service and get it corrected. It's not worth going up in the air and finding out later that something went wrong. Know the hazards. Be aware of what's out there on the job sites, the different conditions to look for, the different hazards with using the lift itself. One of the biggest things is watch your stability. Many fatalities with aerial lifts and scissor lifts is tipping over and getting out of that center of gravity and losing stability. So watch your stability. And with anything like working around anything, you got to keep safety the priority. Safety really is the priority to keep yourself safe, to avoid accidents and protect you and your workers. And that's why we talk about these things. It's to raise awareness and help keep safety the priority in all that we do. So that's the summary. Jason, any questions or anything out there that you see?
We had a question just about certification of lifts actually going in and looking at, or certifying the actual lift annually. Recommendation I gave to the person asking the question was really if you're renting a piece of equipment from an area, they should be doing that. If not, who would you go to, Brent?
Well, there's got to be a local vendor or local service technician that can handle that. I would call the manufacturer and I would ask them if they have any designated people that can do that for them as well. They may have a good local vendor in the area that can do that. Go to the right person. Yeah.
The other question was just about as far as certification of operators, and at the trust we can do classroom training for you, but under OSHA for operators, they want for actually certifying an operator, they want the employer to do that. Is that right, Brent?
That's correct. Yeah, the employer is the one that authorizes it, even with forklifts and other types of equipment. We can do the classroom training, we can help with the evaluations, but it really is the supervisor and the employer that authorizes their employees to use the equipment. Okay. And so they would give a certificate or documentation, however they would need for that.
All right, I'm just looking. I think that's all the questions we've got. Doug, did you have something? You look like you had something on your mind.
Well, I've used these in my past lives. Working in warehouses, we'd use scissor lifts quite a bit. And I understand the temptation to, reach out, to climb up the rail a little bit. And I kind of liken it to, our ladder safety training where, you got that rule, keep your belt buckle inside the rail. And I think that applies to these man baskets, to, boom lifts as well as scissor lifts. Brent said, keep your feet on the floor. don't get your belt buckle up over the top of the rail or outside of the rail, I think is another good way to think about that, to make sure you don't have that accidental fall. People don't fall out of a scissor lift if they're not climbing up the rail in some way. I'm sure that 90% or more of those falls from scissors lifts are people who are climbing, up the rails or leaning out over the rails. So just remember to stay inside the basket.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Doug.
One observation that I've had is, a little less in the operation of the lift, but more in the surrounding areas and dealing with people. Being able to secure your area. You're up there working along whatever you're doing, and you drop a hammer. where's it gonna end up? And so just securing those areas. That's and many times it's not necessarily the fault of the operator that people put themselves in bad situations or bad places, but at the end of the day, that operator's up in the air, and so you've got to be aware and secure that area, but be aware of people in the neighborhood. All right.
Great examples.
I think that looks like that's all of the questions and comments that we have. Brent, final word.
Everybody have a safe day. Thanks for coming to the webinar, and hopefully this raises awareness for you. It's all about safety and the priorities there. So thanks, everyone. Have a safe day.